everyone, and welcome to episode 14 of Franc Talking. I'm delighted to be joined by Deola Laniyan, who I worked with very closely at Cazoo for three years. I'm delighted to have Deola on, and yeah, thanks for making the time to chat with me, Deola.
No, it's a pleasure to be here. Looking forward to having the
Great stuff.
conversation.
We're going to jump into content strategy, how brands can set their teams up to kind of win across the content landscape, why having a content strategy is so important in 2025, given the complete kind of dominance now that AI has in the news agenda, and how brands and agencies are turning to AI platforms for content solutions. So would love to get your views on that as well. What I thought we'd do before we kick off into the kind of the nuts and bolts of it, do you want to give a quick intro in terms of your background, clients you've worked on, and just a run through of your experience?
Yeah, sure. So I've been working in marketing now for around 20 or so years. My most recent experience has been in client-side roles, focusing within the content space. So obviously we worked together at Cazoo. I was there for about 4.5 years, heading up the content team there and across Europe. Prior to that, I was at Viva. Again, I had several different roles at Aviva, first starting in more of a social media function. Then I moved into a group role, which was quite interesting. So that's working with the local markets to help establish best practice when it comes to content. So everything from how to define your content pillars through to how to write a great brief, that sort of thing. And my last role at Aviva was looking after the UK content team. But prior to that, my experience was agency side. So I was at We Are Social for about 3.5 years, working across clients like Tesco, Evian, Volvic, First Direct. So I've got a range of experience across different sectors. And prior to that, I was working in below the line and integrated marketing agencies. So yeah, kind of a varied experience. It's really kind of the last half of my career is focused mainly in the social media and content space.
Okay, great stuff. So kind of the things that I always kind of look at when I worked with in the SEO space is the value and importance of content, and it's such a broad term, content, because you can be text, imagery, video, and it kind of always needs to look at the meeting the needs of that consumer, which is one thing I think you and me always worked very closely on and tried to do at Kazoo. But just to strip it all the way back, like what goes into a content strategy and how do you align that with kind of broader business goals?
The first thing I'd have a look at is the business goals of the company. What is it that they're trying to achieve? The second thing I'd be looking at quite closely is the brand objectives and the brand positioning. And then lastly, what are your communication objectives? For me, that's the kind of the first part of that content strategy. Once I've got a sense of what that looks like, I'm then looking to understand the end-to-end customer journey. Across that customer journey, I'm then dividing that journey up into different segments and different platforms, and really understanding what is the role of content in helping to achieve the brand objectives, the comms objectives, and the business objectives at different parts of those journey, different parts of that journey. The next thing I'm having a look at is the audience. So, what are the audience needs across that journey? Oh well, who are the audience? Where are the audience across the journey? Whether that's on the website, off the website, where are they? What are their needs are? And then I'm having a look at actually laddering that back together again. It means I can then get a sense of what the messaging should be at different parts of that journey, and obviously your key objectives as well. So one thing you want to be doing is translating those business objectives, brand objectives, and comms objectives into things that kind of make sense from a content perspective. So that for me is the foundation of your content strategy. And then I'm looking at different stages of that journey based on what I'm trying to achieve. How do we measure content? And those for me are the kind of the key framework I'm pulling together.
Perfect. Okay, so we're essentially looking at, first off, we've got business goals. Then we look at the audience that's been defined within that kind of framework. You then look at the communication, the amplification to the channels in terms of how you get that across, and then you look at the measurement side. So they're kind of the four key pillars that you would go in terms of that flow, right?
Yeah, exactly that.
How have you found in your experience the best way to present that information to key stakeholders, whether it be C-suite, that you've obviously worked with in terms of looking at the business objectives, to digital teams, to product teams? How have you worked with those teams before, and what kind of levels, methods of communication works best?
I think the first point is making sure you're getting input when you're talking to your kind of partner stakeholders. I remember when we were at Cazoo, we had that session between you, me, and Kimbo, who was looking after the pay side of things, and we kind of had a look at kind of that framework, and it was a chance for everyone to kind of feed into it and making sure it was a collaborative effort once that initial framework was put into place. Once you've got that buy-in amongst your stakeholders, whether that's within marketing or within product, you need to make sure that there's that alignment there. And that's incredibly essential because whilst you're putting together that framework for the entire journey, the content team may not own the end-to-end experience. You might have a CRM team that, for example, is owning part of it. The product team will be owning part of it in terms of the from a content lens, it might be the transactional part of the journey. So making sure that you've got that input and that alignment is extremely important. And then I think when you're taking that then to your kind of your senior stakeholders, about making sure that you're telling that story in a way that makes sense to them. Obviously, we are content experts; they may not be. So it's making sure you're telling the story in a way that really closely aligns with what the business objectives are. And as long as that is clear at each stage of the journey, how you're contributing to the broader business aims and goals and objectives, and making sure it's measurable, that's the best way to communicate your content strategy back to people outside the content team and to your your C-suite stakeholders.
Okay, perfect. And if we look at Kazoo,
Yeah.
we obviously partnered on for many years. When we looked at those early days, like what was required to bring that strategy to life? So obviously we were Lucas, who was on the brand strategy Franc Talking episode that I did a couple of weeks ago. So you sat in his team, but in terms of getting that type of business objectives and audience insight, I guess he was a key part to help facilitate that and then to kind of connect around the business.
Absolutely. So I think what was great about some of the work that Lucas did there was in terms of bringing those insights to us. So he worked with an agency called Folk, and they did some initial kind of research into the sector, into the audience, into initial brand messaging. So it meant that he was a kind of a key in terms of bringing those insights to us. And then obviously he was working quite closely with Darren, who was our chief customer officer. So it's just making sure you're leaning on kind of people you're working into and their relationships around the business as well, so they can evangelicize on your behalf as well with the strategy.
Uh, about the audience, what we're trying to do to help the audience achieve a particular objective. So, what are their needs, and understanding um, their kind of pain points and what they want what they like to see, right? So, working in SEO, I've seen over the years um, many SEOs just use keyword research, like there's X amount of searches for this, let's target this, without really looking at deeper understanding of customer behavior, or trying to look at um, some quality kind of research to try and understand like who the customer is. I I would expect that's to be even as important, if not even more important, for the content kind of landscape. So I'm just very keen to understand how you would have integrated a lot of the audience research to like the initial kind of, so what were the USPs, um, what uh, what are the problems that customers face and how is content going to help solve that. But also it's an iterative process. So how do you keep trends and kind of understanding what customers are feeling? How do you kind of keep that going in terms of the strategy?
Yeah, and it's a good question. I think for us, that initial research that was done by folk into what's the research process that customers are going through when they're buying a car at Cazoo. That was a key piece of research to get into the mindset of that particular audience. What are their perceptions of a Cazoo of car dealerships, and therefore what are the challenges that we need to overcome as the brand? Like that was a huge piece of insight for us as a content team, because you're then thinking about actually what is the role of content. Car dealerships were famously one of the most distrusted professions within that people have to deal with, along with I think it's estate agents, and I can't remember the other one. Do you remember what the other one was?
I don't. Maybe SEOs, but yeah, who knows?
But I think when you get insights like that, you're thinking about therefore like the role of the content, the tone of voice in terms of driving, peace of mind, and that being a kind of key theme that kind of runs through the messaging that you're of the content you're producing. So I think that initial piece up front was incredibly important. I think another key input is your customer segmentation. I think we did it a couple of times at Kazoo, but the last iteration was fantastic in terms of providing lots of insights and jumping off points, which will really help us to hone the messaging to different audiences. And then to your point, I think that iteration process is really important. So it doesn't stop there. I think it's about working if you happen to have like UX researchers in the house, they're an incredibly valuable tool because they're often running moderated user testing sessions on pages across the website. And my team also ran our own unmoderated user testing. So we would share a content page, a landing page with people from the audience that we were targeting and kind of get their feedback, which was really invaluable. And then beyond that, obviously, you've got things like A/B testing, which is still, it's still a way of kind of getting insights from an audience in terms of what's gonna drive the behaviour that you're looking for, what's working more effectively, and that's great to work with Kimbo's team on that, who supported us with the A/B testing across the site as well as the product team. So yeah, very much the beginning part of the process. It's getting those as much initial research as you can. Um, as the business evolves and you get things like your personas or your customer segmentation, using that as an input, and then continually kind of gaining as much insight as the business is growing, and over time on specific kind of tactical pieces of content to make sure that you're always getting that voice of the customer in your ear. I think one of the things from Aviva was that you are not the customer. Remember, you are not the customer. I think the more you remember that, the more you remember it's essential to do as much as possible to kind of understand what the customer's needs are, what their barriers are, etc. And I think one thing from my social media days was social listening. That was a really key part of like kind of gaining that insight into what are customers actually talking about, because search is obviously one input and that gives you some keywords. I think what social listening does, it gives you a much more richer qualitative insight into kind of what people are talking about and questions they're asking and the responses they're getting, and how people are feeling about your brand and those sorts of things. So yeah, really, really audience insight. I can't talk about it enough.
Okay, great stuff. So we've kind of run through in terms of the framework of how we'd approach content strategy, the importance of audience insight, and then making sure that we continue to integrate that within the strategy as it evolves. But in terms of, again, starting at that beginning, in terms of identifying the brand tone of voice and a style guide. So I assume that's crucial to give to your team in terms of the
Yeah.
writers. It's crucial to give to agency partners. If you start looking at podcasts or if you start looking at out of home, like all of these things are essential for those partners to then have a consistent feel and approach to what the brand kind of is. So how would you approach tackling a brand tone of voice and like a style guide, and making sure that the team and also agency partners adhere to it?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the first, before you even start thinking about your tone of voice, you need a really locked down brand guidelines in place. Like, who is the brand? What's their personality? Like, how do you want the brand to make you feel? Um, if you know the brand was a person, who would they be? That's the foundation for your tone of voice, even before you start looking at that individual piece. And I always say that I'm Della, so and I am me, whether I'm at a party, whether I'm in the office, whether I'm at work. It's the same me, the same brand, the same Della, the same personality, the same person. But ultimately, in those different scenarios, how I talk will flex. I'll still have the same tone of voice, but who I am will flex slightly. So when you're looking at your tone of voice guideline, you're thinking about like, how does your brand behave in different contexts? What's the language that I'm using? How do I make sure that the core values identified within my brand guidelines are coming through in terms of how I'm behaving and what I'm saying? Crucial to that, to make it concrete. Well, two things. You want to make it concrete, but you want to make it inspirational as well. And I think, well, I've worked with an agency called The Writer in both at Cazoo and also at Viva, actually. And they're wonderful around helping to build guidelines that paint a picture, that are uh, uh, as almost visual in their its words, to
Yeah.
help people understand what the tone of voice is. And beyond that, you want things are much more concrete, like your do's and don'ts. I think are extremely important. Examples are extremely important to demonstrate how the tone of voice, the messaging flexes and changes. I think that's crucial. And then lastly, I think in terms of making sure that people get on board with your tone of voice, it's not just giving people a document that then goes into a drawer. It's about making sure you
Yeah.
have training and workshops where people can have a go and people can get it right or get it wrong, or discuss and communicate, um, and then people can go away and have a go and then come back again and review how has it gone. Does this feel right? Is that not feel right? What doesn't feel quite right about that? I think that's the process about making sure that it's really embedded and making sure all the relevant stakeholders are involved in that as well, and to your point, the agencies you're working with as well.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And it comes down to like a culture perspective as well, and how you like instill that within the company. So I always I always remember that you were always great at reminding me that it's people before cars in terms of what we were doing, right? And you've felt that like when you live and breathe by those particular
Yeah.
values that then is then instilled. So I it is important in terms of the environment that you're in and what the kind of culture is kind of embedded like. So I do think that plays a big role too. Great stuff. So we spoke about the importance of collaborating with like digital teams, obviously C-suite, to keep them updated in terms of key metrics, but then also product teams, PR, everything like this, right? How have you found in your time working like, in any of the agencies or the brands where you might have got pushback on a certain part of the content strategy? And how would you have dealt? How did you deal in terms of trying to work with that team, and then but also making sure that it stuck to those brand guidelines?
Um, trying to think, probably back to agency days when it's kind of that early on in that client relationship and you haven't quite got to grips yet with the brand. I think that's where you can kind of get a pushback on clients thinking, oh, that's a bit too far in that direction, or and I think that comes down to, and I think once you realize that actually, if your content strategy is wholly embedded within the brand and ladders up to, as I was saying, the business objectives, it's completely measurable, you shouldn't get any pushback. And I think it might take time, especially if you're not in-house, to kind of get to know the brand inside out. But I think if you can nail that, people should be nodding along, going, "Yeah, of course, yeah," because you're not, it shouldn't be anything new in terms of, well, it should be a new level of thinking, but it should resonate what's already kind of considered within the business, if that makes sense. So to avoid pushback, I'd say make sure you understand the brand inside out. Make sure you've done that work around the audience that we spoke about. Make sure that you're the everything within there ladders back up to the right tone of voice, making sure that you're clear on the metrics and the KPIs. I think then you shouldn't get too much pushback.
So, as we spoke about, obviously content is such a broad term where it can be video, imagery, text, and it could be across search, it can be out home, it can be social. The rise of social from the mid noughties gave, like, obviously marketeers like you and me an opportunity to expand in terms of expertise. There was more channels to optimize towards, but then there's obviously a lot of challenges that you have to then, like, jump on a certain thing and think, right, is Snapchat right for this particular audience? How do we work on TikTok? Then there's stuff that rises and then kind of drops. You've got Reddit. So there's all of these things that have come into kind of the fold from, like I said, from probably the mid noughties and the rise of social. Given the work you've done on social media strategy and the teams that you've led, how do you approach, and I know it differs per brand that you're working on, but how do you approach a social strategy to make sure that ladders up to the kind of overarching content side? But also, when you've got paid social and that might be sitting in a different team, how do you ensure that they also adhere to those guidelines?
Yeah, again, I think the key thing with social media is that it has to be, well, organic anyway. It has to be pull content. You have to kind of create content that people are going to want to engage with. So if they come across it in there, they're just scrolling. So when you're thinking about it as part of your broader content strategy, you're thinking about, like, what are the stories that we have to tell that are genuinely interesting, that are even more customer centric than the stuff that you're doing on your website. You're almost starting with the audience, but most importantly, you've got kind of, like, always think about it as a Venn diagram, which is, on one hand you've got your brand in one circle, things that you want to talk about. In another circle, you've got kind of like things that the audience cares about, and that kind of element in the center of the circle is what we call your social media proposition, for example. That's how you start thinking about your from a social perspective, because if you just keep over in this brand space, no one's going to care. They're going to keep scrolling to find things that
Yeah.
they find engaging and interesting, etc. So you want to find that sweet spot. Thinking about that, again, starting with social listening is going to be completely important. Like, what are people naturally talking about already that's relevant to your world? Then what's the brand spin you can put on that? How do you tell your stories in a way that are going to resonate with that particular audience within social? And the other thing you want to be thinking about is how you can make your content super relevant to the platform that you're on. So I think
Yeah.
maybe back at the beginning of TikTok, I think a lot of marketers were probably a little bit guilty of saying, right, okay, let's just take our Instagram post and pop it on TikTok. But it's super important you think about, part of your content strategy, right? What's going to be relevant to that particular platform? How can we make sure we're capitalizing on the features, what's trending over here, and making sure you're creating content that's relevant for that particular audience on that particular platform?
Yeah, 100%. And I feel TikTok changed the game as well, because the algorithm optimizes for you, right? So you're less likely to be following other, you can still obviously follow, but in terms of what you consume, you don't even have to follow anyone because it knows who you are and it knows. So it's it puts it back in the core of just being audience focused and the content that
100%.
resonates with that. And you see, like in the old days with X, then Twitter, it was who you were following, and then all of a sudden the feed is like, I'm not on X anymore, but it was just what it thinks you want to see, and playing, obviously taking a leaf from TikTok's book. So do you think that has been one of the major changes in social over the last like 10-15 years, is the rise of TikTok and how um, like audience focused it has become?
100% audience focused, but also trend focused. Like you're not going to get any reach on TikTok unless you're kind of jumping into the trends that people are engaging with, because the algorithm is like, people like this sort of stuff. If you do this sort of stuff, I'm going to show it to people because we know it's going to get engagement. So I'd say definitely that kind of focus on that engagement driven algorithm, but also the movement, the shift towards short form video content, which has really
Yeah,
exploded.
no, definitely. And which brands do you like what they're doing on social? Because like you say, it has to be authentic, right? And we've all seen the ones where there's a bit creative, where you've got a bit of talent that has nothing to do with the product, but they've just kind of like shoehorned it in somewhere, and you maybe as marketeers you can see straight through it, but you, like which brands do you like in terms of what they're doing, that they're balancing that obviously commercial elements? You don't want it to be so abstract that you're like, what the hell is that? But it actually works both from the commercial and from the audience side.
Yeah, I'd say for me, and it's probably not a surprise, it's been talked about quite a lot, like Duolingo. Like I can just literally sit there and just scroll through their TikTok account. And you just end up kind of you're laughing, you're entertained, you're engaged. But front and center is the products at all times. It's, they're talking about when DeepSeek launched in China, and they did this great kind of um piece of content which was all about learning, starting to learn Chinese. So learning a new language is at the heart of what Duolingo do. But they did it in a way
Yeah,
that's super relevant to the platform. So they're one. I'd say there's other brands as well who I think are doing some great stuff that's slightly more irreverent. So Loewe, there's a whole campaign actually around how to pronounce her name. I've got no idea, but Loewe do some really great content where um, quite often the product's at the heart of the content, but visually it's super, yeah, it just works. Greg's I was looking at actually a couple of weeks ago. And again, the product's at the heart of it, but it's not in a way that is we want to tell you about the product. It's here's an engaging piece of content that features the product. But again, it's just that kind of, but they're really focusing on what's going to genuinely entertain. I think part of that, I think, as well as what's happened more recently as well, is that um, the brands I think who are doing it well generally have like content creators working in house within their social media teams. So it's
yeah,
not
yeah,
it's not marketeers who are trying to do social. It's people who are
yeah.
creating this content anyway, and who are doing it in their own spare time, who get how these platforms work. I think that's been a really great development, and I think that's led to an improvement in social content versus perhaps when I was doing it more, as a full-time job when I was at We Are Social. I think that's yeah, I think that's been a great development.
I think that's a fantastic point. And there's two things I want to go through there. That point on the social creators, I remember this was years ago. Maybe I'm fabricating now, but there was Lad Bible. I'm sure that they hired like a 16-year-old as their like social media manager or whatever it was at the time, and they were like, well, who understands social better than this? Obviously it's not just age. This person was like, right, but at the time, wherever it was, on Facebook, on Twitter, the forums. So it would make sense to then invest within that kind of somebody that lives and breathes it, as opposed to, like we say, we've got the audience, we've got the strategy, we've got this, which is still important. But if you don't fully believe it, it's very hard to make that authentic, kind of to come across. And the other point I was just going to raise is the Duolingo one. So I think you're spot on, but we always see just the output from it. Not nobody, but obviously if you drill into it, looks at seeing the work that has gone into building that online. So like all the testing, all the posts that would have flopped at the start, the strategy that goes into it, the hiring of talent, like all of these things are crucial. And it's not something, because I think as well, like brands sometimes expect like an overnight success, or how can we make this viral and things like this, but it kind of takes away from all of the work that goes in up front, and it can take some time to, obviously you can have your one hit wonders, but in terms of what Duolingo have done, I think that is a nice case study to highlight that level of investment, the hiring of creators in-house, and then kind of making sure that you maintain that consistency with the audience that you've got.
Yeah, 100%.
Okay, right. Now we will get into everyone in content's favorite subject, AI. And I think it's just mad how, like, when we were working together, we would never have even talked about generative AI. And we haven't, it's not that too long ago that we were
Yeah.
working. So October 2022. And it was November 2022 that ChatGPT like took off, right? And I remember doing a podcast after I left Cazoo, and I think it was literally around the time of ChatGPT being launched. And I was asked the question, would I ever use like AI for content like creation? I was very dismissive of it, like, oh well, no, of course not. Then when I tried ChatGPT out, and I looked at certain things that could be automated, so like an alt attribute, or give me a selection of page titles or header ones or ideation kind of stuff, I was like blown away given what my initial thinking was. Because you and me would have worked with tools before, and it's like, oh, it auto generates this, and you're like, well, this is rubbish, what's just been done. And I was genuinely surprised, and then I felt I sounded a little bit like a dinosaur, where I was like, well, no, I'd never do that. But then once you've experienced it and you've seen it, I can see how this can be used. But I'm also then, and this is why I talk to clients or stuff that I've done on this newsletter before, you do have to worry about like the long-term consequences of it, right? So there is from the search side, if you have somebody that says, right, we'll get rid of the whole content team and we'll just have AI producing this, and we'll just like, look how much content we're getting through, right? No one's proofreading it. Like there's a small check, and there's all of these other signals for SEO that will go in. So you don't know what long-term impact that has. I also, from a personal perspective, with kids and obviously with like teams and stuff, like critical thinking is like diminishing if you do not have to like think about like what you're going to write about or what you're going to talk about, or doing some sort of research. Like, and let's say I'm on ChatGPT every day for so many tasks, but it is a worry as well that your critical thinking does diminish when you have this technology that's at your fingertips. Um, so sorry, that was a bit of a long-winded in terms of my thoughts with AI, with content, and the fact that so much has changed since like the month after we
Yeah.
started working together. What are your initial take with how brands are integrating AI into their content workflow? And also, like, we'll get to like the future for it. And it's very hard to obviously predict where we're going to go for it. But how would you be utilizing AI to improve the like overall content output?
Yeah. Um, I'd say just kind of going back to what you were saying before around like the implications for AI. I think obviously AI can help improve efficiency, it can drive volume, but then you have to think about what does it mean for creativity over time if everything becomes so driven by AI. And this is where I kind of go back to some language that was used in my last role actually around human driven AI assisted content. I think then if you can kind of get the right balance where humans are involved to the right level at the right stages in the process, I think it could be an incredibly powerful tool. I think the danger is the whole give it to AI, have a quick check, publish.
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
we'll go to a world where you'll see diminishing returns and people just start turning off from content because it just becomes doesn't resonate anymore, becomes it just not great. And I've seen some really great. I think it was last week I saw a really great piece of work from I think it's a creative agency who had produce this beautiful video, AI video for, I think it was like a perfume brand, and it was stunning. But in the post on LinkedIn, they listed all the people who were involved in the process. So yes, it was AI was a core part of that, but there's still that human element that I think is what is the magic that means that you're going to create something truly great. Now, in terms of thinking about like the workflow, well, just efficiencies, I think AI is great. I love it. I use it all the time as well. I think you can think about it right at the beginning part of the process, such as defining personas, which would sometimes take a huge piece of work. If you've got audience research, you can feed it into AI and produce some really quite good personas, and making sure that you're giving it the right level of data so those personas are data driven. That's one thing you can use, and those are super useful when it comes to producing content. Through to my last role, I worked with a really great SEO manager, Ben Walker, and he developed some really great AI briefs. With the right prompts, it would develop some great briefs that you'd obviously review as the person who was the brief owner before you then briefed it into the writers, and that's another great function for it as well. And then I think at the other end of the process, from a writing perspective, like the sub editing and the proofing, I think AI can be absolutely great as well. And even when you're looking at optimizing an existing piece of content, I'm not averse to using AI to do that. I think from an SEO point of view, keeping the content fresh and updated is super important, as long as there's that human element of it as well, that it's human driven, AI assisted. I was chatting to some friends earlier in this week, actually, over some drinks, about how AI is impacting them within the agency world. And one of my friends, Kate, was talking about how it's really kind of happened to reshape completely the production process. So that means you're able to produce, more variants, more high quality variants of a piece of content at speed. So I think there's various different roles for it from the whole end-to-end workflow where AI can have a role to play.
Good stuff, Deola. So in terms of looking at if there's any kind of content managers that are looking to step up to a more senior role, like what kind of tips like would you give to like these people in terms of how to kind of make that move from a manager role up to like an associate director, business director, and then head of department? And what kind of tools would you use on a regular basis? And they could be like, obviously, if they're paid for tools like Airtable, or if you're looking at Monday.com or stuff like that for planning. Like, it'd be great just to get your thoughts in terms of some top tips that content managers could take, and also like what tools they would use to kind of help enhance their kind of productivity.
Sure. I'd say that in terms of the first half, in terms of like stepping up to a more senior position, is having that strategic output on things. You go from being less kind of task focused and more focused on the bigger picture. So that's really understanding the strategy, the why behind what you're doing, and also the what in terms of what you're trying to achieve. So I'd say to people, ask your manager to get involved in the quarterly planning. As you know, at Cazoo, we often worked on planning together. Obviously, SEO and content had a huge overlap, but I'd also work with the managers in my team to make sure they're feeding into those plans, because then they're understanding what the business objectives are, how content is laddering up those business objectives, making sure that they are really focused on like what's working, what isn't working, and why, to help them think about what would I do differently next time. I also encourage them to get out there and to build relationships with stakeholders across the business to get that kind of that broader 360 view, making sure they're chatting with the product team, with the digital team, with the SEO guys, making sure they understand the bigger, broader picture. Leaning into things like the customer segmentation work. So if you've got a new segmentation that's being rolled out and they're aware of it, say, I'd like to be involved in the training sessions. I'd like to come along. Raise your hand up to try and get involved in more things outside of your day to day that give you a bigger picture, a sense of the bigger picture, so you get a sense of where you're going. Because ultimately, as you become more senior, you become less focused on where you are on the track, and more focused on kind of laying the track for the team to then kind of follow along on.
Yeah.
Second half of your question was around tools and things. So at Cazoo, obviously we both joined pre-launch. I think you joined pre-launch as well. Yeah, we both joined pre-launch, and we went from having no content to having a ton of content. So I was like, we need to find a way of managing content and all these workflows. So I was quite keen, and I kind of started thinking about actually what tools are out there to help us to achieve that. And I don't even remember I initiated like a two-way procurement process between Monday and Airtable, and Airtable came up tops. So we ended up using Airtable within Cazoo, and actually it was a key tool in my last role as well in terms of operationalizing the business, in terms of workflows and having visibility of what content exists. Other tools that I think are wonderful are things like Miro. Miro is great in terms of collaborating with people across the business virtually online. It's, for those of you who don't know, it's basically like a um, virtual board.
Whiteboards, yeah.
A virtual whiteboard. Thank you, Andy. And that was great for running workshops and things and documenting the outputs of workshops, or even documenting the outputs of like any user research that happened. Notion is wonderful for making sure you've got that kind of central knowledge base across the business where everyone can kind of dip it in to find the latest version of your tone of voice guidelines, or a view of the the product roadmap, so you can make sure what you're doing within the content world is laddering, is also kind of you're aligning what's happening within product. And then I guess from in my last role, I was working more with some of the SEO tools, and Google Search Console is great, and you don't even need to be like an SEO to understand how that, to get some useful insight into that, which can help give you a sense of how your content's performing from an SEO perspective.
Oh, great. That's great tips, and also for the selection of tools. And I guess, like, again, you can go to a company and it depends on their tech stack that they've got. But I'm like you. Like, if I look and I've worked with a client and they've got Miro, Figma, if they've got Slack, like I mean, some people love Slack, some people hate it, but then you can obviously get a lot more out of, because you know them well. But I guess it is that curiosity and eagerness to learn about like different tech that comes your way. But yeah, I think there is a lot of like, there are a lot of content tools for AI now as well, which again, some of the stuff that I've seen produced can be quite good. But like I said, I've said on this on previous videos, like I see on LinkedIn about like, oh, I produced 300 pieces of content within an hour, and I grew my revenue by X amount. Like, and I just think that there's more to it than just that simple. That there's no human input anymore, and you can just have this small group of people that can cut out a huge amount of. I think you want efficiency. You want to make sure that people are contributing towards the growth of the company, and if they're not, then they have to move on, and you have to make that decision. But to kind of have this setup where all power is just consolidated by this small few that can then farm out certain things to AI, like it's a bit of a worrying kind of trend, and as to where we're going to go. And I don't fully believe that we are going to go all in that way. And I do still think, like I've said again on previous ones, it matters who's written something as well. You have to have some personality and belief in terms of what you're doing. There can be functional stuff. How do I open this account? Like, how do I retrieve this information? But if you're talking about like pensions at Aviva, or if you're talking about health kind of content, like, do you want someone with experience that's contributing towards that, rather than an LLM that has training data from an experienced person? Like that's how I kind of see it anyway.
Yeah, I'd agree with you.
Great stuff. Thanks, Della. So if we're looking back at your career, which
Hmm.
and just to kind of highlight here, the my best case study was Cazoo by a mile in terms of what we achieved in terms of team, in terms of revenue, and it's very sad how it ended, but that was no part in terms of the digital side of things and the broader marketing strategy. And you were such a crucial part for the SEO success. Like it wouldn't have been achievable without you and the team to do that. So you've had a very successful like career, and like every time we talk about how SEO and content works together, I always refer to how we would work together in terms of building um, that kind of case study that we've got. But in terms of what you've seen over the last like 15, 20 years, we've been in the space for the same amount of time. What was the one thing that you've kind of learned from like implementing something, thinking, "Oh, if I'd have done that a little differently, like I could have achieved this a bit more?" And like, how did you kind of build and kind of learn in terms of the experience?
I'd say the biggest kind of lesson is just to go out and there's that word again, be an ambassador for your content strategy. Go out and talk to different teams across the business, make sure they are bought into the approach and everyone's on the same page. And that's probably the biggest lesson, isn't it? Again, just as I was saying with your um, tone of voice guidelines, it shouldn't be a thing that goes into a drawer. It should be a thing that's kind of front and center that people understand and people are across the business. And I think in larger organizations, it's even more important that people have that sight and visibility and are bought into what you're trying to achieve to make sure that it doesn't sit within the content team, but it's something that exists that's delivered on across the organization. I think that can be complex in some businesses like Aviva, for example, where you've got huge organization, many different stakeholders, and I think there's a risk that your content strategy could end up becoming a blog that sits on one part of
Yeah,
the
yeah.
website as opposed to like the end-to-end experience. So yeah, go out there, build the connections across the business, um, be the ambassador for your get buy-in, get input, and that's one of the biggest lessons that I've learnt.
And that so in your earlier days, would you have been working more in isolation, like working on content and then like you have other parts of the business that would come late to the kind of party and then have a comment or stuff like that? So like because
Yeah,
I was very siloed, like I'd just be working on what I wanted to do at this moment in time.
yes, exactly that. It becomes, I was producing the strategy. My team would then roll that out, and I'd present that to my C-suite or my senior stakeholder. But that's just not enough. I think breaking down the silos as much as possible and building those relationships is going to be the key to to yeah to great work.
No, definitely. Um, um, So one of the things that I remember years ago, it's more the search side, was about how voice search was going to change everything. And maybe when like you were at Aviva, um, that might have been like a discussion as what, like obviously not as much as within the SEO community, but that for me is kind of one of the big things that like didn't kind of go to where people thought it would do. And I was a believer, like, because it made, not a believer in terms of what was it, 50%. I think there was a stat that was kind of churned out on many agency decks about 50% of searches will be done by voice by 2022 or something like that, which was nonsense, obviously, in the end. I still like use voice activation. It's not just a very linear kind of like with a device and things like that. Um, but you also had like Google Glass that came out, which was probably before its time. But what have you seen that has been? I mean, so obviously we've got those two, but what have you seen that's been kind of the big trend that people were jumping on that kind of didn't really go anywhere?
Mm. So I think we are ripe for a new disruption. I think we're ripe for a new iPhone that's going to completely transform how people are engaging with content. Now, whether that's we're still quite early on, but I think there's something in the whole glasses
Yeah,
sphere that might be coming down the line. But I think there's something happening soon. I think we're at a stage now where yeah, there was, I think there was like a piece of tech I saw that was in your palm of your hand that, again, there was lots of PR around it. It didn't go anywhere. I can't even remember what it's called. I think there'll be lots of kind of small fires that start and then get extinguished. But I think there's something around the horizon that's really going to transform. I'm not quite sure what it is yet.
I think that's a really good point. And that kind of, so like I was quite dismissive of Google Glass and voice search, but they just evolve into different things then. Do you know what I mean? So like
Yeah,
Google Glass as a product was 2013, I think, like
yeah,
died of death, but just wasn't ready to be embraced. And if you can have, like, again, I'm not going to wear one anytime soon, but you've got the Ray-Bans Meta kind of AR glasses. There'll be more that come with this type of setup. So the fact that that product died, but the idea still kind of has just been
agreed.
built, will probably, I think you're right. You probably just see things like this, but it is important for teams though, and sometimes you don't have a choice, but for teams to not just jump on certain trends that might
Mm.
not lead anywhere, because it's a waste of resource. You don't even know if audiences are engaging on it. And I found like there was a lot of, like, I think there was a stat on the number of earnings calls that mentioned AI before November 2022 versus afterwards, and it
Right,
like
yeah,
skyrockets. It's like, well,
yeah.
what are we going to do for this? And it's
Mm.
just, you need to have a kind of consistent strategy that you can adapt based
Yeah,
upon changing behaviors, but essentially you have to make sure that you stay on that path. Otherwise, you can get distracted in terms of what comes along the line.
agreed. It should be strategy, objectives first, tech second. Tech can be
Yeah,
an enabler, but I don't think you should let the kind of the tech drive what you're
yeah,
doing.
yeah, totally, 100%. So great stuff, Della. So thanks again. And just to kind of finish off, I saw you in action, like building out a team, like from like one person out to many, like I think it was about 12, 13 at one point.
19.
Um, 19,
Big
sorry,
Europe, yeah.
yeah. Um, so, and it was a very it was a very low churn. It was a successful team in terms of processes, respected throughout the business, producing like content for online, for like for out of home as well. Um, like, how do you approach like leadership with that particular role and kind of mentoring certain talent to obviously get the best out of them?
Yeah. I think for me, it's about I want to be the person that empowers people to do their best work whilst having fun. I think it's about creating an environment where people um, celebrate that moment when that piece of content is right, when the success happens. And I think that creates an excitement, and also it creates a place where people can have fun along the way. And I think I remember speaking to somebody in product, they were like, "Yeah, your team do seem to be that way. You know, they'll join a call, they're, excuse my language, shit hot at what they do, but it doesn't have to all be serious. And you're creating an environment people are having fun, doing great work, and they're less likely to leave. Um, so giving people, when I say empowering, it's like not micromanaging them, but also saying, right, this is yours to own. Hiring the right people in the first place is key to that. It doesn't always work out, but if you can get it right most of the time, I think that's a big contributor um, to success from a team perspective. And then I think in terms of like mentoring your team, it's about understanding as much as what we need from them as a business, but also what they want in terms of their careers, their own personal development, and making sure you're working with them on their personal development plans and being there to help guide them, support them wherever that's needed, and providing regular feedback through your one-to-ones. And also, I think a coaching approach really helps as well. Don't give them the answers, ask them the questions. People are much more capable than they even know. So just ask questions, get them thinking about what the right solution is. I think that goes a long way.
Perfect. Della, thank you so much for joining me today. It was as always, our discussions were super insightful, and yeah, you covered a great deal there. So thank you so much for your time. I'd love to have you back on maybe in a couple of months, We can see how AI is getting on in terms of content creation and what kind of other kind of changes that we've seen. But yeah, thank you so much again, and I will see you soon.
Thanks, Andy. All the best. See you soon. Take care.